Thank you very much to the organizers for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I've enjoyed this series so much. So it's a real privilege to be invited to be part of it. I feel I need to give some explanation of why somebody who works in a psychology department talks about microbiomes in a One Health series. So in around 2007, 2008, when the Canadian Microbiome Initiative started, there was a workshop to talk to Canadian scientists about how this initiative should go forward, and there was also a commitment to bring in perspectives on social and ethical implications of genomics. And so, because I was working on social and ethical aspects of genomics at the time, I managed to get an invitation to that workshop, and there were 3 of us, I believe, who were from the social sciences, humanities, broadly conceived. So one person in bioethics, one person from law, and then I came from the social sciences. I was very junior at the time. The other 2 social science and humanities researchers were very senior, so people even now that I respect a lot. And they came away thinking, well, there's nothing really new here. Like, this is the ethical issues are no different from, say, human genomics and so on. Whereas to me, I was fascinated from day one, and so I continued with that. And the early research on looking at social and ethical aspects of human microbiome research were a lot about research ethics. So how do you protect privacy and confidentiality of people who are donating their microbiome samples? How do you deal with questions of ownership and things like that? But as time went on, some of us started focusing more on societal issues. So what is it about the science that we need to look at from a social and ethical perspective? What are the consequences of this science sort of entering society? And I think there are some very real issues there still. In fact, at the time, a lot of our work was speculative, whereas now I think really we need to look much more seriously at applications and technologies that are being developed with human microbiome science. But as I was focusing on this, my perspective started shifting away from what is the new technology doing and what are the ethical issues, and more towards what is the microbiome science telling us about what's already happening. So things that we've been doing for decades, sometimes even centuries, microbiome science was showing us all sorts of problems that are going on with that. And that then led to this work. So I know this is an interdisciplinary audience, and so people are coming from the social sciences, from different areas of natural sciences. So I'm gonna talk at a level that I hope is accessible to all, but please do feel free to throw up your hand and interrupt me if something I'm saying is not making sense. And for those of you who are specialists in areas, please excuse me if I butcher any part of your specialty, and come talk to me afterwards. Carl, I'm looking at you. Okay. So the core message of this entire presentation is that we are surrounded and inhabited by microbial ecosystems. And a One Health approach is incomplete, I'm going to argue, without a systematic vision to protect microbial ecologies that are essential for human, animal, and environmental health. So I'm going to take a sort of staged approach to get to that message, and I hope that by the end of it you'll all be agreeing with me and jumping up and down and on board with the message. So I'm first going to talk about the human microbiome, on a very basic level, what is it, what am I talking about, and why is it important. I'll then introduce the idea of microbiome stewardship, and I'll explain what I think that is and why I think it's important. Yes?
Are we able to take pictures of yourself?
Yes, please, go ahead. And then I'll talk in more detail about this concept of microbiome stewardship and how it connects with social systems and with policy. So first, what is the human microbiome? The image I've got here is from the National Institutes of Health website. This is an archived website from when the Human Microbiome Project was first launched in 2007. On there, they define the human microbiome as the collection of all microorganisms living in association with the human body. The key point here is that even then, there was already very strong recognition that the human microbiome is essential for health. For example, microbes produce certain vitamins that we don't have the genes to make ourselves. They break down food and extract nutrients we need to survive. They teach our immune systems to recognize dangerous invaders, and they also produce helpful anti-inflammatory compounds to fight off disease-causing microbes. So this recognition has been around for a while, and now research, of course, is going into the details of how exactly does all of that happen. Now, definitions matter, and they're important, and how to actually define the human microbiome there is tension around that. People disagree and so on. Here is a somewhat more elaborated definition. You don't need, I'm not going to read it out, and you don't have to read it. I'm just putting it up there to emphasize that there's a lot more to just saying it's the collection of microbiomes. So there's also the metabolic activity, there's how they interact with each other. So there's a lot of stuff there. For the purposes of the talk today, that's not so important. I'm just flagging it as background knowledge. Okay, so one of the things that was, I think, sort of groundbreaking out of microbiome science early on was that it sort of had a paradigm shift with it about moving away from a pathogen focused view of health towards an ecosystem view of health. And I think many areas of biomedical science now really take that quite seriously, that we need to understand what the microbial ecosystems are doing as a whole, not just focus on eliminating pathogens. But, and I'll get to this point later in the talk, I think many other areas of human and animal health and ecosystem health don't actually recognize that shift. Or even if they recognize that shift conceptually, there's not a lot of practical action that follows that recognition. So essentially, the recognition from microbiome science is that human genomes and microbial genomes co-evolved, and that there's a largely symbiotic and mutualistic relationship between the two, in the sense that microbes benefit from the human body as an environment that has food, moisture, the right temperature, and so on, and we benefit through immunity and metabolic activity. And in terms of psychology, which is my home discipline, there's also increased recognition of the role of microbiomes in cognition and other aspects of human psychology. So everything I've said here shouldn't be controversial. This is fairly well recognized in microbiome science, although not necessarily well recognized in fields beyond that. An important aspect also is that when we ask questions about the nature of the human microbiome specifically, is how stable is it, how is it formed, and so on. So quite a lot of research has focused on that already, and one of the key points here is that the gut microbiome in particular develops largely during infancy and seems to be relatively stable after that. Of course, it can also be changed after that as well, but there is a certain stability, and key environmental factors in shaping the microbiome include prenatal exposure, gestational age, mode of delivery, feeding type, pro and antibiotic use, and host genetics. So in terms of talking about health and illness then, what are some of the conditions that have been linked to changes in the microbiome? Asthma, inflammatory bowel disease, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and autoimmunity are some of the main ones, and there's increasingly others as well, including some cancers. And now we also see increasing rates, and so increasing prevalence of some of those conditions. Some of those conditions are also linked specifically to Western lifestyles and environmental conditions. And this knowledge is being used to develop treatments and better patient outcomes for individuals with these conditions. So this knowledge is not just abstract and theoretical, it is practical, it is being used in a sort of a clinical treatment sense, and it's also in some instances being used for preventive health, so public health, preventive health applications. So the big take-home message from all of this is very simply that microbial ecosystems are essential to human health. So if you're with me on this, I'm happy at this point. And I want to emphasize this is not controversial, right? This is well-recognized science at this point. Okay. So the next step in the journey I'm taking you on is the effect of industrialized societies on microbiomes. And this, I would say, is not as well established as the first part of the story, but there's evidence from specifically two sort of strands of research. One is research on effects of immigration, and I've got US here. There's a study also on immigration to Canada, but essentially immigration to industrialized, highly developed nations from less industrialized origin countries. And the general gist from this research is that there's a deterioration of microbiomes, often associated with diversity, but there's other markers that are being investigated, and that deterioration is associated with adverse health outcomes. A second strand of research in all of this is comparison studies between what are often called Western microbiomes. It's a problematic term, but it's used in the literature, and various remote communities, often indigenous communities, but essentially communities that have far less contact with built environments, with antibiotics, with processed foods, all that kind of thing. And so here again, the findings are that the microbiomes of the remote communities tend to be healthier, and again with different markers that are being investigated. Often it's still based on just diversity, but also better health outcomes associated with microbiome-related conditions. So the big take-home from all of this is that in spite of recognized benefits of industrialized lifestyles, there seems to be a reduction or even extirpation of certain microbial taxa and their metabolic functions. So the big sort of take-home message that I'm taking from this literature is that there's something that we're doing in industrialized societies that is damaging microbial ecosystems in fundamental ways. Now, I'm using the word damage here, and I've had some fantastic conversations about this, but when can we talk about a damaged ecosystem versus just a changed ecosystems? So I think those are kind of some fairly fundamental questions that we really still need to investigate. Okay, so the third part of this journey is now looking at what can we do about this. So if we accept, number one, that microbiomes are essential to health. Number two, if we accept that there's something about Western industrial lifestyles that is damaging microbiomes, what can we do about this? Well, a lot of biomedical scientists are focusing on exactly those issues. And so they're looking at what kind of decisions are we making that affect our microbiomes. And so there's good research that says alcohol consumption affected, dietary decisions affect microbiomes, exercise, do we take probiotics, sanitary living conditions. So some people are proposing a hygiene hypothesis that if we live too clean, that might be problematic, right? So those are all the kind of issues that are talked about quite frequently in the scientific literature. And I would say it's a main perspective of certainly biomedical research in the field, that they would focus on, here is your microbiome, let's study your microbiome, let's study your lifestyle practices and how we can change that to improve your microbiome and make you healthier. And so the idea here is that these kind of decisions are individual level decisions. I can choose to eat less processed food and more broccoli. I can choose to exercise more and do those kind of things. But the main point that I'm trying to convey here is that many of the effects on our microbiomes are not subject to individual level decisions. And in particular, here are some examples. So geographic region of birth or where we live. These things, so certainly where we're born is not in our control. For most people on the globe, where they live is also not under their control. And yet, because of the built environment, because of environmental pollutants, all sorts of things, there are huge effects from those factors on the microbiome. Use of antimicrobials in broader society. So even though I might have some control over whether or not I choose to take antibiotics, some control, I don't have much control over how much other people around me use antibiotics. I also probably don't have much control over antibiotic use, for example, in livestock, things like that. Then there's environmental toxins and pollution, all of which impact microbiomes. And again, there's not much really I can do about the quality of air around me and the quality of the water and things like that. Then there's industrialized food production. To some degree, if food is labeled, I can make decisions around that, but there's also financial constraints on that. But very often, we don't even know what goes into the food production process, so sometimes we don't even have the knowledge to make those decisions. And then there's also cost and availability of fresh foods. So simply, where I live, do I have access to this? And in terms of my financial capacities, am I able to afford this? Another thing to look at is the critical period of microbiome development in infancy, which I've mentioned before, which again is outside of certainly the individual's control, possibly in the parent's control, possibly. And so what I'm trying to challenge here is the rhetoric of empowerment of knowing your microbiome, which is very common in sort of microbiome studies, especially commercial applications. It's like, we can tell you about your microbiome so that you are more empowered about your health. And certainly, to some degree, that works for individual level decisions, but for the larger social determinants of health, I don't think that works. And by the way, this argument I'm making is very much a parallel argument of social determinants of health, arguments that are made in public health quite frequently. So very briefly, I'll just talk through a quick example to illustrate what I mean here. Obesity is something that's targeted by many public health folks as an issue to deal with because of the health risk factors associated with it. And a dominant representation that's been documented by social scientists is that obesity tends to be represented as a problem of individuals eating too much and not exercising enough. So we're too sedentary and we eat too many energy-dense foods. So when you conceive of obesity as that kind of problem, it implies that we need to individually make better decisions. I need to decide to exercise more. I need to decide to eat better. But a lot of epidemiological and other public health research suggests that this is not a good way to think of obesity. Because we're finding increasing obesity rates on regional and global scales, independently of just individuals making bad decisions. We also find a close connection between food consumption and the food industry advertising, especially in children. We also have research on food deserts, where there's low access to fresh foods and available foods are largely highly processed, high in sugar, fat, and salt. So there are social determinants that shape the outcomes of obesity, and it's misleading to think of these as purely individual level decisions. That's not to say that we don't have some individual agency and choice, but if we look on a population level, the evidence is that individual choice is quite constrained. So this is how I'm suggesting we need to think about microbiomes. Yes, maybe we have some choice that we can make about improving our microbiomes, but much of what we're talking about in terms of how the microbiome is shaped is beyond individual level decisions. So the take-home message of this part of the story then is that if we take seriously the importance of sustaining healthy microbial environments, we can't rely simply on educating people and saying you need to make better decisions. That's not going to go very far. We need to make collective decisions and actions. What do I mean by collective decisions? Policies, regulations on food processing, that kind of thing. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. So the next part of the story is then, how do we conceive of the human microbiome as a thing? Because there's already been a huge paradigm shift with the advent of microbiome science. Some people talk about the microbiome being an extra organ in the body. Some scientists talk about the holobiont or the superorganism. So those are some of the words that are thrown around. So the idea that we really need to conceive of the human being quite differently and the microbes in our body quite differently as just these microbes. So that's already been happening. But the suggestion now is that we need to go even bigger. So it's not enough to even think about my human body being largely microbes. We also need to look at how it connects all of us. So there are both vertical and horizontal mechanisms for sharing microbes and microbial genes, both. So in terms of the microbiomes, a lot of the seeding of the microbiome happens at birth, and so studies, for example, compare vaginal versus cesarean birth and the differences in microbiomes there. But there's also person-to-person sharing. So studies have looked at people on the same sports team, people who cohabit and are not genetically related, and tend to have more similar microbiomes. And of course, every time we shake hands, the common air we breathe, the water we drink, the soils we touch, we collectively share microbial exposures. And we have those continuously. There's also, very importantly, the built environment, which also affects the microbiomes. So the argument here is that when we think about acting on preserving healthy microbiomes, we need to think about how we do this not just for my healthy microbiome, but for our collective microbial exposures. So how can we create environments that foster healthy microbiomes rather than intervening with you and me one at a time? So what am I suggesting then for collective action? What kind of things am I talking about? Well, in public health, of course, public health is very aware of the importance of microbes, but the focus tends to be still very pathogen focused. So even though everyone, if you read newspapers, it's impossible not to know about the importance of good microbes, but how do public health agencies and offices actually take action on that? And there's very little really, if anything at all. The focus is still on managing pathogens. But as we look at more chronic illnesses and the importance of healthy microbiomes in preventing those chronic illnesses, we need to figure out how we can have public health policies that actually help prevent those illnesses in terms of microbiome protection. In agriculture, there's already focus on pesticides and biocides, but I think no real kind of attention and explicit regulations or protections about their effects on microbiomes with subsequent effects on human and animal health. And similarly with antibiotic use. Again, there's of course already regulations around that, but I think not so much with attention to what are the consequences for microbiomes in animals and then also in humans. Industrial food production would need to be focused in terms of the effects of processing, packaging, and additives. Again, we're finding a lot more attention nowadays on the dangers of processed foods, but I haven't seen much at all on a regulatory level specifically on what is it doing to microbiomes. Urban planning, right? So there's some fascinating research about having living walls both in houses and in urban landscapes and the effects of those. Building designs, ventilation. Again, we're focusing on ventilation, especially because of COVID, but not really much because of effects on microbiomes. Water management, air pollution is connected to microbiomes, and soil pollution. So when I'm suggesting that we need to act on a collective level rather than an individual level, these are the kind of things that I'm talking about. So the next take-home message here is that once we start conceiving of microbiomes as collective phenomena, not individual, but human collective phenomena, and we recognize that they are important, we also need to recognize that they're not going to protect themselves, right? Like soil, like air, like water, unless we have regulations, they will deteriorate, right? So the Great Lakes are an example. Air quality is an example. These things will deteriorate in the face of industrial activity, unless, of course, we act to prevent that. So this then leads me to this concept of microbiome stewardship. And so a group of us first came up with this quite a while back, and what we were trying to do at the time is shift thinking from an individual biomedical level to more of a public health level. So to say, yes, microbiome is important, absolutely, and not just on the individual level, on the collective level. So that's sort of what we tried to do. But when we published that paper, we actually didn't offer a definition of microbiome stewardship. We sort of offered it as a kind of just a way of thinking about where we should go. And since then, a lot of very important things have happened. So a lot of microbiome science has advanced in terms of the specifics about what do particular pollutants do to the microbiome. And also, I've talked mainly about human microbiome, but of course, we're talking also about soil microbiomes, animal microbiomes, and so on. There's also been a lot of focus on the social equity issues that intersect with microbial ecologies. And so this really kind of connects this whole story of microbiomes into the social world. So here's a diagram that our group of collaborators came up with to try and imagine what should good microbiome stewardship look like? Where do we need to be paying attention, and what do we need to be achieving? And the idea is that microbiome stewardship starts with recognizing that collective microbiomes are a shared resource, like water, like air, like soil. We then need to determine what microbiomes or microbial functions we have to steward, right? So so far, much of my rationale building has been quite vague. I've said microbiomes are important, but I haven't said which ones, and I haven't said which ones in which contexts. We need to specify that. We also need to then actually come up with a definition of microbiome stewardship and a framework that actually supports that, and guiding principles. And then we also need case studies that actually show us how we can achieve this and how this might work. So I've got here not a definition, but an initial description of how we conceive of microbiome stewardship. So microbiome stewardship involves the recognition that microbiomes are an essential foundation for life on Earth. It requires recognition that microbiomes are collective phenomena and that different microbiomes are interdependent. Microbiome stewardship, then, is the conscious and strategic conservation and protection of microbiomes in the face of human and other activities that may lead to deteriorating health of humans and other animals. Effective microbiome stewardship requires collective societal action at regional, national, and global levels. So, if you're with me so far, that's good. If you're thinking, yeah, but this is all sounds a little bit too pie in the sky, you're also right, because there are some very specific challenges here that we have to figure out how to address if we take this seriously. And firstly, the first challenge is a scientific challenge, and that is microbiome stewardship is a nice kind of intuitive word, but what specifically are we stewarding? So, for example, if we talk about stewarding water as a scarce resource, that is contentious enough, and there's a lot of difficult questions even there. But at least the kind of the object that we're trying to steward is fairly clear, right? Water that we can use for various different activities. But when it comes to microbiomes, on an abstract level, are we talking about specific species or taxa of microbes? Are we talking about a specific community? But then also, are we talking about this community in this particular environmental niche or in general, right? And then, of course, we also have to come up with metrics. At what point is the microbiome healthy, and at what point is it no longer healthy? These are questions that we do not know the answers to. We maybe know a little bit in some specific context, but in general, we don't. So that's some of the scientific challenges. Then the regulatory challenges are maybe even bigger. So when we talk about conserving or protecting microbial ecologies, these span many different jurisdictions, even within the same country, even within the same province, right? So air quality, water management, public health, agriculture, these are all different ministries. And then, of course, microbes go across borders, right? So how do we do that, right? There has to be international agreement as well. So this is complicated. So when we published that 2014 paper, we thought we were done. and I was going to walk away. After all, I'm not a microbiologist, but why would I need to work on this? And now, after coming back to this and looking at how the science has moved forward, we realize not only do we realize, like, we're certainly not done, we realize even having done several years more work, we're only starting to think of starting points in how we can move in that direction. And so the key starting point that we're working on at the moment is actually providing some precision to defining the idea of microbiome stewardship and guiding principles. So that's what we're working on right now. And I want to take a couple of minutes to explain why I think definitions are so important. And so I'm working here in analog to the definition of health as, for example, given by the World Health Organization. And there's actually quite an interesting sort of scholarly literature on that, on debates about how should you define health and what should be included and what should not be included. The point I'm trying to make here is that how you define something matters, because when that definition enters official policy documents, those definitions then guide decisions like who can apply for funding and what kind of research can get funded, what kind of practitioners are authorized to operate under that definition, and so on and so on. So for example, if I define health largely as the absence of disease, that favors, first of all, like focusing on pathogenic problems, but it also favors biomedical lenses. Then we found with World Health Organization definitions, they included things like social determinants of health. Now that's a very powerful move forward, because now you can look at how social indicators have very powerful influences on health, and you can now start intervening at that level. You can be more preventative, and you can do all sorts of amazing things. Then there's also questions about what about emotional aspects of health, mental aspects of health. What about spiritual aspects of health? Right. So as you expand and change the definition of health, you make different policy responses possible. So how do we know how we come up with a good definition of microbiome stewardship, given that it's going to have these important ramifications? I was at a meeting, a public health meeting a few months ago, where a public health lawyer was talking about coming up with a new public health act for Canada. And he said, look, you want me to come up with a good act? Give me a case of beer and lock me in a room for a week, and I'll give you an act. I'll give you an act. But he said, but that it wouldn't be a very good act, because it'd be just me sitting down and kind of coming up with something, right? So the World Health Organization definition for health became better over time because of scrutiny, because of conversation, because of input, because of dialogue over time. And we want to do the same thing with a definition of microbiome health, but ideally we don't want to wait several decades. So we want to, before we actually publish any definition of microbiome stewardship, we want to have those dialogues and we want to have that engagement. And so this is the process that we're just starting off now, and we're working on a draft definition and framework that we want to then make available to scientific experts for commentaries. We also want to talk to decision makers about this, and ideally we want to also have some case studies where we can involve affected communities and not just scientists who are working on these issues. So the last take-home message then is, because of the scientific and regulatory challenges in trying to conceive of how we could make an idea like microbiome stewardship work, we need to start off by actually having an acceptable definition and framework and guidelines that has been tested in a number of diverse local contexts, but can also be used to act across different policy domains. Okay, so in summary, microbes and microbiomes are essential to human health and, in fact, to all life on Earth. Evidence is accumulating that we're doing harm to microbial communities that is directly affecting the health of humans and other living species on the planet. This harm is occurring on a societal level in the form of pollution to soils, water and air, industrialized food production, use of biocidals in agriculture, widespread antibiotic use, and the built environment. And there are currently no protections for microbial ecosystems. So there are no tangible ways that this is being paid attention to and acted on. And what we're trying to do is to introduce the concept of microbiome stewardship as a first step in working towards a collective societal vision for protecting the microbial foundations of life on Earth. So I'd like to thank my collaborators, Rob Biko, Sue Ishak, Emma Ellen Verco, Mallory Chaudhry, and Diego Silva, who are working with me on this project. Thanks also to my research team here, the Discourse Science Publics team, and also thanks to funding from CIHR and GEAR. And here are some references for anyone who's interested. Thank you very much.